Now things are getting real. We're 12 weeks into the season. We're about to hit Thanksgiving. We're going to have a full slate of games all throughout the week. And it's almost playoff time for fantasy football. Yeah, look, it's pretty much make or break time. Either you're going to make the playoffs or you're out of it for the season. And if you are heading toward the playoffs, you better make sure your team is prepared, not just for week 13, but the rest of this season. So no matter how good you think your team is, there's always a way to make it better. Let's look at the waiver wire pickups that you should be interested in. And if nothing else, you get these top players so that somebody else can't use them against you. We've been trying to help y'all win all season long. Help us out if you haven't yet. Hit that subscribe button. Give it a click. It takes 1 second. It helps us out tremendously. We're trying to get to our goal of 100K subscribers. Before we talk waiver wire pickups, we have to start with the injury report as always. Thankfully, it was a lot slower this week than it was last week, but still some big names here. Let's start with T. Higgins. You know, Bengals were without Jamar Chase for non-injury related reasons this week, and T. Higgins was out there until the very end of the game, hit his head hard, and we already know it's concussion protocol. Doesn't matter really what goes on here throughout the week in practice. You remember that they are playing on Thanksgiving Day, Thursday night, so T. Higgins is basically already out. You can just count on him not playing this week now. Jamar Chase will be back, so that's good. Look, I will just say they're going to need somebody else to take Higgins' place here. You know, a lot of people were interested in Andre Yosevich. Was okay, didn't do a whole lot for you if you did flex him out this week. Mitchell Tinsley was the guy who showed up big, not just a touchdown, but some nice grabs in that game. Not sure if he's someone you want to start, but just felt like throwing it out there. Probably the most significant injury of week 12 came in the night game. You know, to add injury on top of insult, like things weren't bad enough already based on the scoreboard for the Tampa Bay Bucks. Well, then Baker Mayfield, franchise quarterback, gets injured. Looked ugly. I mean, he was holding that shoulder in pain. This was his left shoulder, so not the throwing arm, but still. This is something he's had issues with before. You know, it almost feels like there's some sort of injury he's been playing through anyway. Baker Mayfield does not look like himself, and now there is physical injury here. So we're definitely going to have to see what's going on, because that would be a huge shock to the system, as if Tampa Bay hasn't had enough injuries already just in the receiving core and then the running backs. It's like one thing after another. But I mean, obviously if Baker Mayfield is out, you can't feel great about this passing game with Teddy Bridgewater at the helm. Alvin Kamara was on the injury report heading into this week, and well, he had an ankle injury beforehand in practice, but he left with a knee injury on a rough-looking tackle there. Now, it doesn't seem like it's as bad as it initially looked, because he did keep the helmet on. It looked like he might potentially go back in the game. He didn't, though. And so, look, it's too early to say if he's going to be in or out for this coming week. Devin Neal was the only guy who got any touches in that backfield. I'm not including Taysom Hill. And so Devin Neal might be for the deep leagues, you know, somebody that you could potentially flex. But look, this is a week. Again, there's no teams that are off. I'm not going to recommend Devin Neal as a pickup here. I just think that's a little too deep. I mean, he was involved as a pass catcher, but as a rusher, didn't do a whole lot. And you know what, this Saints offense just wasn't good enough for me to think, okay, yeah, I want the backup running back here. Likewise, Ashton Genty left late in the game with an ankle injury. And this one, again, a little tricky. We're not sure exactly the status here. We'll monitor it throughout the week. And likewise, if Genty misses, do you really want Raheem Mostert or Zamir White? You probably don't. So let's hope that Genty is good to go. And for the Chiefs, a couple of receivers who were banged up. Xavier Worthy was battling an ankle issue throughout the week in practice. It still bothered him again. He was in and out of the lineup on Sunday, so check on that. But at the same time, at this point, Xavier Worthy really doesn't have to be rostered in fantasy. Rashee Rice does. Rice left the game for a little bit, but then came back, and he was there in overtime, made some big grabs. But it is worth monitoring. If that hamstring bothers him, it could be significant enough, and also short turnaround because the Chiefs play on Thursday. So we're going to have to watch Rashee Rice's practice status. Bam Knight of the Cardinals was decent until leaving with some sort of a lower leg injury. Not sure exactly what's going on there. Let's hope it doesn't matter. Trey Benson, he's got to come back at some point, doesn't he? And also Michael Mayer, the backup tight end for the Raiders, left. I don't know if this matters a whole lot, except maybe Brock Bowers will get more attention. All right, now this week's top pickups. Let's start as we usually do with players that are more highly owned, less likely that you can find them, but if they're out there, you just should get them. And honestly, whether you need a quarterback or not, if you could find Joe Burrow on your waiver wire still, go ahead and do it. Get him, because he should almost surely be back in week 13. Sounded like he was going to play this week, but at the last minute they decided no, even though he was a full participant in practice, was running with the first team. Kind of weird that they didn't play him, but this might be sort of like an optics thing, because let's face it, they're facing the Patriots in week 12. Didn't feel like they would probably have a good chance against that defense. Maybe they want to ease him back into things, or maybe they just want to make sure he was 100% for Thanksgiving, because he's going to be playing on Thursday night. And look, again, I said, even if you have a really good quarterback, you want to play Joe Burrow, because he's going to get the Ravens this week on Thanksgiving. Last year, in 2 games against the Ravens defense, 392 yards and 5 touchdowns. That was just one game. That was the first game. And then 428 yards and 4 touchdowns, right? This Baltimore defense, remember, early in the season, was even worse than last year's version. They've gotten a little bit better, but still, look, Joe Burrow is not just a guy that you want to pick up. He's almost a must start. So just check to make sure that, if somebody didn't grab him, or maybe somebody did and they're impatient, they said, well, like, he's not healthy, and they dropped him again. You never know what people do, so definitely get Burrow. And sometimes good players get dropped just because of the bye, and the Chargers were off this week, so talk about a pair of bolts here. Also, look, the last couple of weeks, the Chargers have been trending down, like especially right before the bye. We saw a guy like Kimani Vidal all of a sudden look far less effective. And of course, everyone thinking, what about Omarion Hampton? He's scheduled to come back, eligible, and may, as we've been hearing, supposedly come back in week 13. But there's no guarantee that he comes back in week 13, right? That's just what we've been hearing. But let's see it first. He has to actually play. And then look, if it's his first week after missing several weeks of action, you really think they're just going to give Hampton all the touches in this backfield? I don't think so. I understand Kimani Vidal hasn't been as good these last 3 games for the Chargers that I keep talking about. He's only averaged barely 3 yards per carry, right? He had 1 pretty good game based on his volume and 2 down games, so people just feel like he's droppable. So I understand all that. I'm not saying Vidal is a guy you're going to run with the rest of the season, especially in the fantasy playoffs, but right here, right now, this week, he is still going to be, at the very worst, I think, in a timeshare 50-50 with Hampton, and he could have all the work to himself if Hampton is not ready to go. This is still a good offense. They had a week off. They're going to be ready. So with the Raiders on tap this coming week, yeah, I think Vidal definitely has value, whether Hampton plays or not. And likewise, Rondé Gadsden at tight end. I get it. Some of you don't want to hold a backup tight end. Totally fine with that. Gadsden, just like Vidal, had been trending down. Had a couple of really big games, got everybody's attention. But these last 3 games, it just hasn't been quite the same. He hasn't even reached 70 yards, and he doesn't have a touchdown in any of the last 3. But there are different reasons for that. To some extent, just game script didn't require the Chargers to throw as much. Gadsden still has value, and this week, that matchup, great for him. I will just throw this out there for what it's worth, that the next 2 weeks, when a lot of you, the fantasy playoffs, are either about to start or maybe have started, man, brutal matchups for Gadsden as a tight end. Gets the Philadelphia defense and the Kansas City defense. So I understand if you've got him that you might want to flip him if that's even possible. But at the very least, here now, week 13, you should want Gadsden. Now, a lot of times later on, I'll give you kind of a low-end streaming quarterback option if, of course, you can't get a guy like Burrow. But let's go with a guy who now at least is getting the respect he deserves. He's more than half owned. Jacoby Brissett. I mean, he's not just a streamer anymore. He's a solid QB that you can pretty much put in your lineup and not worry about. Coming off that monster performance the week before against San Francisco, we had to throw it a record number of times. Well, thought there could be a letdown here with Brissett. Maybe his just arm was tired, but no, he went for another 300-yard performance. Only 1 touchdown, but still just very solid, not turning the ball over. And think about the fact the last 2 weeks that Jacoby Brissett hasn't even had the number 1 receiver, Marvin Harrison. He could, I was going to say should, but he should be back. But he very well could be back this week. And so that just makes it even better here. I mean, Brissett has been so solid. Don't go looking for the matchups and these other guys who maybe could. If Brissett's out there, just play him. And for what it's worth, this coming week, they're going to face the Tampa Bay Bucks. That's a game that could definitely turn into a shootout. Now, it's been a while that we've been talking about Kyle Monangai. I mean, I can't remember how many weeks ago we talked about him as a potential stash, and then a sneaky ad, and then okay, you should just go ahead and add. And yet we still have to talk about him. Kyle Monangai just over the 50% threshold, but he's still available in a lot of leagues. And look, this is the best time to possibly add him if you haven't already, because now he's not even just part of a timeshare here. It's like he's kind of taken over the backfield. And Monangai already had become mostly the goal line back, and he already had been carving out a significant role for himself. But then after DeAndre Swift fumbled in week 12, it was pretty much all Monangai from that point forward. And so in week 12 against the Steelers, Kyle Monangai went 12 carries compared to only 8 for DeAndre Swift. Wound up with 48 yards and a touchdown. Right, that's pretty good. He always has touchdown upside because, like I said, when they get near the goal line, he's the one they give the ball to. Now, he didn't do anything as a receiver this week, and that's the limitation, right? He can never be a PPR monster because he just isn't used enough out of the backfield. But he's now become the lead runner there for a pretty good Chicago offense, and now is just putting up points regularly and consistently. And the other side of that matchup, we saw a very different type of back, Kenneth Gainwell, who is more valuable in PPR because he's mostly a receiver. And look, this is the second week in a row I'm talking about Kenneth Gainwell. And that last week when I put him on the waiver wire video, I did have that disclaimer. Look, take what he did, week 11 with a grain of salt. It was the Bengals. Bengals are, of course, the worst defense out there. And a lot of what Gainwell did was as a receiver, and of course, he's a good receiving back. And it's not like the Steelers are loaded at wideout, but it's not necessarily something that's repeatable. But he almost repeated it because he was still the leading receiver for the Steelers in week 12. Not in yardage because he only had 30 receiving yards, but 6 receptions. Again, for a running back, that's a good total. Gives you a very high floor in PPR. But what was surprising is that Kenneth Gainwell in week 12 against the Bears was the leading rusher for the Steelers, 92 yards, even though he only had 10 carries. Jaylen Warren was the lead back in terms of carrying the ball, but this week, Gainwell was far more effective as a runner, which was different from last week. But the point is now, rushing and receiving, Gainwell definitely has himself a very solid role in this offense. And for what it's worth, this offense is not ever going to be pass heavy just because they can be. And so even if Rodgers is back next week or Rudolph, that doesn't matter. Kenneth Gainwell has definitely proven that he can be an asset. And for what it's worth, I know Warren been a little bit banged up here and there in the last couple of weeks, but he didn't really leave this game with injury so much. And still, Kenneth Gainwell, a higher snap rate than Jaylen Warren, and he ran twice as many routes. And so, you have to say at this point, he's just as valuable and maybe more valuable than Jaylen Warren in your PPR leagues. It's time to talk wide receiver. Before I get to a couple of interesting rookies, let me also just remind you, coming off the bye, you might be able to find Troy Franklin. Like, he wasn't universally owned and, was off this past week. So sometimes you just got to drop a guy to make room for someone else. Troy Franklin could be out there. Check your league's waiver wire. And Franklin, as you know at this point now, is the leading receiver for the Denver Broncos. Now, I say that he's the leader in terms of receptions. He's got 46. Courtland Sutton has 45. All right, so yeah, we're splitting hairs here. Sutton still has more yards. As far as touchdowns, they're both scoring almost equally. So it's pretty much even here. But just the fact that Troy Franklin is just as valuable as Courtland Sutton in fantasy is a little mind-blowing. And that recently it's been more Franklin because early in the season, it was mostly Sutton. And so a lot of people view Franklin as more valuable, and I can't argue with that. This last game before their bye against Kansas City, a really good defense, he wound up with 84 yards, was the leading receiver for the Broncos. While this isn't exactly the most consistent pass offense, to be sure, the next couple of weeks, that schedule is great. Denver's going to face the Commanders and then the Raiders. I'll just say it ahead of time here. If you're thinking about Franklin to pick him up, he's going to be at least a solid start each of the next 2 weeks. All right, time to get deeper. Let's talk about rookie Jaden Higgins for Houston. Houston offense has been, a little bit embattled at times. And, a lot of people like to point out the fact that over the last 3 wins that they've had, it was a different quarterback. CJ Stroud has been out with concussion, with Davis Mills taking over here. The chains have been moving, right? They don't really have to do a whole lot. Let's face it, with that defense, they barely even have to score, but he's limited turnovers, right? They're playing somewhat more conservative, just playing smarter on offense, and it's working. Now, CJ Stroud will probably come back this week. I mean, it seems almost sure that he'll be back under center. That's not a bad thing. All right, let's not pretend like he was the problem. The play calling has changed here, the philosophy has changed. They know what they've got: an elite shutdown defense and an okay offense that's best when they can try to run the ball, not with Nick Chubb, but with Woody Marks, and then just, again, move the chains in a pretty methodical fashion. Jaden Higgins is going to be part of that. He's a guy that now has been seeing more horizontal routes, and they've been using him more than just as a field stretcher. He's been getting steadily involved in this offense now for the last 3 weeks. He's gotten at least 7 targets in each game, and he's come down with at least 4 receptions in each game. But also, even extending beyond that, he's finding the end zone. He's got a TD in 3 of the last 5 games. So while Higgins hasn't had any one of those monster performances, right, nothing that really screams like add me now, I mean, he's been quietly pretty solid here, even with Christian Kirk back, even with Nico playing. You know, he's a part of this pass offense. I think he's here to stay. And this next couple of weeks, again, should be pretty valuable. They face the Colts in week 13. You know, with the way the Colts play on offense, like, I get that the Texans are a really good defense, but they're probably going to have to at least do something to keep up with this Colts offense. Higgins is definitely worth it. You know, even in your 12-team leagues, he might be flex worthy. I know it's tempting to just completely avoid and ignore these next couple of offenses, but like, this is why these players are available on the waiver wire. Calvin Ridley, he's out for the season, right? Remember, early in the season it was Alec Iomanner. Well, both those guys were out in week 12, and so Chimera DK basically is the default number 1 receiver for this Titans offense. But this isn't the first time we've seen DK make a splash in the box score. You know, in the middle of the season, DK had a pair of back-to-back nice games for fantasy, and then a couple of games where he did basically nothing. It was easy to just forget about him again. But look, he's the number 1 guy here because, I mean, let's face it, there's nobody else really left here. But also, he's made plays not just in special teams. You saw, of course, that kick return. He's one of the best return men in the NFL already as a rookie. But he is making some plays as a receiver. So 5 catches, 44 yards, and a touchdown in week 12. Cam Ward doing what he can with what he's got. For his part, looking a little bit better each week. And I mean, look, the DK is the guy who isn't going to get a ton of receptions, maybe not a ton of yardage without making those big plays, but he has that home run ability. We've seen it. And so because of that, I think he's definitely worth a flex in most leagues. And then that Jets offense, I mean, who's the number 1 guy now with Garrett Wilson out? It seems like it's John Mechie. That's right, John Mechie, who was moved from the Texans earlier. A move that nobody really paid any attention to, because what had John Mechie really done in his career? Well, maybe now this is what he needed, a fresh start. You know, A.D. Mitchell, a lot of people realize he came over to the Jets and that Sauce Gardner trade get a little bit more attention, right? He was a high draft pick, but look, John Mechie was as well. Mechie had a great college career playing at Alabama, and then injuries kind of held him back and just never was able to carve out a role for himself in Houston. He's doing it already here with the Jets. Week 12, he had 6 catches for 65 yards and a touchdown. And look, Tyrod Taylor being there kind of steadies the ship. This is still not going to be a great pass offense. Don't kid yourself, it's not. But they need to throw it to somebody. And Mechie looked like the guy that's making plays. Again, between the two, I know Mitchell is interesting still, but you got to be able to catch the ball to do something with it. Both Mechie and Mitchell had the same number of targets here, 7 targets. They're having the same opportunity. And yet Mechie caught 6 of 7. Mitchell only caught 2. If anything, this should just make you more encouraged about the fact that Mechie might be the number 1 guy going forward. And if you're still streaming tight end or looking for help at the position, you can't get Gadsden, well, welcome back Brenton Strange. This is a guy who came off of IR, missed several weeks, and immediately made an impact in the box score. 5 catches for 93 yards in his return. Brian Thomas Jr. continues to miss. There's no guarantee he's playing next week either, but you know, that's not necessarily going to affect Strange. Strange is in an offense that does still like to throw the tight end. They're still not super deep at wideout. Even if BTJ comes back, I do feel like Strange is going to have a role. And so for what it's worth, next week, get the Tennessee Titans. It's a pretty good spot. And I will say, I was going to talk about Dylan Sampson on the condition that Quinshon Judkins' injury might have been serious. It doesn't look like it was. Judkins did go back in the game, and so I'm not worried about Judkins, but you know what? I think we still need to talk about Dylan Sampson. Like, sure, he took that one play, probably seen the highlight because it was Shedeur Sanders' first ever passing touchdown. It was a screen pass, and Sampson just took it to the house. That inflates his numbers, right? Make it look better than what it was in terms of fantasy points. But it isn't just that one play. It's also the fact that this was the first time in a long time. Well, in fact, this is the first game since week 1, the season opener, where Sampson has had somewhat of a role as a runner. And of course, he was the guy in week 1. We all thought he's going to be the running back for Cleveland all season. And then Judkins immediately signed and came back right after that. Look, since then, Sampson has not been a factor. But this week, in Shedeur Sanders' first start, not coincidentally, we saw Sampson had 7 carries. Again, his most since week 1. I've been expressing concerns about Judkins' efficiency over the last few weeks. I think finally that coaching staff took notice. That's why they tried some different things. They put Judkins in the Wildcat formation. That's how he scored his touchdowns, right? These are kind of gimmicky plays, but it worked. And they're giving him a breather. They're actually giving Sampson some carries, putting Sampson on the field more. And it worked. And so why not try to do that again? And with a guy like Sanders in there, maybe we do see more screen passes, more involvement to a guy like Sampson. This is more of a deep league option for sure, especially if you're considering starting him. But also at the same time, if Judkins does miss time, Sampson becomes the lead runner again. All right, that's what you need to know for the waiver wire breakdown heading into week 13. Get those waivers set as early as possible. Get those lineups set before Turkey Day is here. You want to make sure you head towards your fantasy playoffs in top form. And for that reason, don't miss all of the videos we have ready for you for week 13. It's going to be in this week's playlist.